Open a Bible to Mark chapter 6 verse 3. Right now, the names are right there: James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, and sisters. The church has spent 1700 years explaining why those names don't mean what they obviously mean. You were 8, maybe 9, sitting in a Sunday school room that smelled like carpet cleaner and construction paper. The teacher, a patient woman, kind, the kind of teacher who spoke to children like adults, was explaining Mary. Someone in the room asked the question. You don't remember who, you just remember the question. Did Mary have other children? And the teacher smiled the way adults smile when they have the answer ready. No. Mary remained a virgin her whole life. Jesus was her only son. That was it. You wrote it down or you didn't. But either way it went in, filed under things you knew about Christianity. Never revisited. And for years, maybe decades, that was enough. Until the day it wasn't. Until the day you sat with an open Bible and actually read the verse. Not someone's summary of the verse. Not a sermon built around the verse. The verse. And there were 4 names. And sisters. Sitting in the text, exactly as they had always been, since before you were born. My name is Nathan. 12 years teaching history at a Catholic school in Evansville, Indiana. I resigned in my early 40s. This channel is where I put what I've found since. About 3 months ago, I was grading student papers. Advanced New Testament Survey. One of my distance learning students had submitted a paper on the synoptic problem, the question of why Matthew, Mark, and Luke share so much material. She was using Mark 6 verse 3 as a structural example, and she quoted it in passing. I had seen the verse hundreds of times. I read past it, registered it, started writing a marginal comment on her methodology. And then I stopped. I went back to the quote. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and of Judah and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? I put the pen down. I counted. James, Joseph, Simon, Judas. 4 named brothers and sisters, plural. I had known that verse was in the Bible. Every New Testament scholar knows it's there. But I had never sat with the actual weight of it. Not the doctrine around it. Not the commentaries. Just the text. Mark is not being oblique. Mark is not speaking in code. Mark is listing names, 4 brothers, sisters. All of them real enough that the people of Nazareth knew them. The verse isn't arguing a theological position. It is recording a fact that the townspeople are using to dismiss Jesus. Who does he think he is? We know his family. That's what's happening in the verse. And if you remove the doctrine about Mary from your reading, just for a moment, the verse means exactly what it says. Now let me show you the academic record. Because the English-speaking audience deserves the full chain of evidence, not just the feeling that something is off. John P. Meyer, a Catholic priest and New Testament scholar, published the first volume of A Marginal Jew in 1991 through Doubleday's Anchor Bible Reference Library. This is not a skeptic writing to tear down the church. This is a Catholic priest working inside the scholarly consensus, being honest about the text. Meyer's conclusion on the brothers of Jesus is unambiguous. The Greek word used in Mark 6 and Matthew 13 for James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas is adelphos. In Greek, adelphos means brother. That is its primary, standard, unambiguous meaning. Meyer argues, as have most critical scholars since, that Jerome's 4th century attempt to translate adelphos as cousin in the context of the brothers of Jesus is linguistically indefensible in the Greek of the New Testament. Let me explain the Jerome problem, because it is the hinge on which this entire debate turns. His name was Sophronius Eusebius Hieronymus. We know him as Jerome. In the year 382 or 383 of the Common Era, Jerome wrote a treatise. It was called Adversus Helvidium, against Helvidius. A man named Helvidius, a Christian writer, not a heretic by any formal definition, had argued the straightforward reading. Jesus had brothers. They were biological children of Mary and Joseph, born after Jesus. The Gospels say so plainly. Jerome wrote a refutation. His argument was this. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, the Bible that Jesus and his followers actually read, The word adelphos sometimes appears where the original Hebrew means a relative broader than a biological sibling. Genesis 12:4 uses adelphos for the relationship between Abraham and his nephew Lot. Genesis 14:14 uses it again. Genesis 29 uses it for cousins. Therefore, Jerome argued, adelphos doesn't always mean brother. In context, it can mean kinsman, relative, cousin. The brothers of Jesus were probably cousins. This argument, written by one man in 382 CE, more than 350 years after Jesus, became the standard Catholic and Orthodox position. And here is where it breaks down. The New Testament is not the Septuagint. The New Testament was written by Greek-speaking authors for Greek-speaking audiences, and Greek has a specific word for cousin. It is anepsios, written this way in Greek, anepsios. That word exists in the New Testament. It appears in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. Paul uses it to describe the relationship between John Mark and Barnabas. That is the actual Greek word for cousin. Paul knew it. The Gospel authors knew it. Every Greek speaker of the first century knew it. James, Joses, Simon, and Judas are described in Mark and Matthew using adelphos, not anepsios, not once. Not in a single manuscript, not in any early manuscript tradition. If the authors of Mark and Matthew and the author of Galatians meant to say cousin, they had the word. They used the other word. Every time. For every one of the four brothers. Let me give you Paul, because Paul's testimony is the strongest evidence in this entire case, and it is almost never the first thing anyone reaches for. Galatians chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. Paul is writing about his first visit to Jerusalem after his conversion. This letter dates to approximately 48 to 55 CE, within 20 years of the crucifixion. Paul is writing as a first-hand witness to the early Christian community. He writes, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Ton adelphon to Kyriou, the brother of the Lord, that is Paul, writing in Greek. Within a generation of the events, using the same word, adelphos. For the English-speaking audience, I need to be clear about why this matters. Paul personally met James. Paul spent 15 days with Peter and had one direct encounter with James in Jerusalem. This is not a tradition passed through generations. This is a first-hand account from a man who was there. And Paul describes James as the Lord's brother, not the Lord's cousin, not the Lord's kinsman, not a member of a broader family network. Adelphos. Bart Ehrman, New Testament scholar at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, has stated this plainly in multiple published works and lectures. Galatians 1:19 is among the most proximate first-hand evidence we have about the family of Jesus. Paul met the man. Paul used the word that means brother. And then there is 1 Corinthians, chapter 9, verse 5. Paul is defending his right to travel with a believing wife. He writes, Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord in Cephas? The brothers of the Lord, hoi adelphoi tu Kyriou, are listed here as a distinct, recognizable group. A group well known enough that Paul can invoke them in a passing reference. They travel. They have wives. They are a specific set of people that everyone in the Corinthian community would have known about. If these were cousins, the phrasing is bizarre. No one says the cousins of the Lord, as if that were a meaningful category. Paul is describing a family unit. He is describing men known by their relationship to Jesus. And the relationship he names is adelphos. I have read the counter-arguments. I have read Jerome's Adversus Helvidium multiple times. I have read the Epiphanian tradition, which proposes that Joseph was an elderly widower and brought children from a previous marriage into the household. And here is what I'll tell you. None of those arguments engage directly with the word anepsios. None of them explain why four authors in multiple texts writing in Greek for Greek audiences consistently use the word that means brother when the word that means cousin was available and present in the same New Testament corpus. You have accepted an answer before reading the question. I don't say that as a criticism. The answer was handed to you first, before you were old enough to open the Bible yourself, before you knew what anepsios meant, before you had any way to compare the text with the tradition. The answer was the frame. Inside the frame, you never asked what the word was in Greek. You never asked when the doctrine was defined. You never asked where the cousins idea came from or who invented it. You didn't need to. The frame held. And here is the hardest part of what I've found. The frame was not built from the Gospels. It was built from a single treatise written 350 years after Jesus by a man arguing against a reading that, by the plain text, was the correct one. Let me walk you through the timeline of the perpetual virginity doctrine, because this is not ancient. This is not something handed down from the 1st century. Jesus died, by most historical estimates, around 30 CE. The 4 canonical Gospels were written between roughly 65 and 100 CE. The idea that Mary remained a virgin after the birth of Jesus, and therefore that the brothers were cousins or stepchildren, was not a 1st century teaching. The first text to propose the Joseph as elderly widower theory is the Proto-Evangelium of James. This is an apocryphal gospel. It was written around 150 CE. It is not in your Bible. It was never in your Bible. It describes Mary's childhood in the temple as a dedicated virgin. It describes Joseph as an elderly widower with children from a previous marriage. It provides the narrative framework for why Jesus would have grown up with brothers who were not Mary's biological children. This text is the foundation of the Epiphanian view, the view held by many Eastern Orthodox traditions that Joseph's children from a prior marriage are the brothers mentioned in the Gospels. Here is what you need to know about that text. Pope Gelasius I, in the year 495 CE, condemned the Proto-Evangelium of James as dangerous literature. The Church banned it. It was placed on a list of condemned texts, deemed false and inappropriate for Christian use. And then the theological framework it provided. The elderly widower Joseph, the virgin mother protected from biological motherhood before and after Jesus, became the foundational structure of official Marian theology. The Church banned the source, and then built the doctrine on it anyway. Not in secret, not through a conspiracy, through the accumulated weight of tradition, which moves slower than scholarship and stops for nothing. Let me give you the 2 internal gospel arguments. Because even inside Matthew and Luke, the same authors who tell the nativity story, the same authors whose texts the Church uses to support the virgin birth, there are phrases that cut directly against the perpetual virginity doctrine. Matthew chapter 1 verse 25. And he knew her not until she had given birth to a son. The key word in Greek is heos ho. It means until, more specifically, up to the point when. This is a standard Greek construction that marks a change of condition. He did not do X until Y happened, implies that after Y happened, the condition changed. If Matthew had intended to convey that Joseph and Mary never had conjugal relations even after the birth, he would not have used this construction. Greek grammar is precise. Matthew knew what he was writing. Heos hu means the situation changed after the birth. Matthew 1:25 is not a statement about perpetual virginity. It is the opposite. And then there is Luke chapter 2 verse 7. Mary gave birth to her firstborn son. The Greek word is prototokos, firstborn. This is a technical term. In 1st century Jewish culture, it had legal and inheritance implications. The firstborn son had specific rights, responsibilities, and status under Mosaic law. But the word prototokos carries no meaning if there is only one child. You do not call a child the firstborn unless there are subsequent children to differentiate from. An only child is not called firstborn. An only child is called an only child. Luke's word choice implies the existence of children born after Jesus. Luke is one of the 4 canonical evangelists. He was writing within a generation of Jesus. His phrasing implies what it implies. I want to tell you about a moment in the Gospel that most people have forgotten. Mark chapter 3 verse 21. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, "He is out of his mind." His family. They thought he had lost his mind. They came to take him away, later in the same chapter, verse 31. And his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside they sent to him and called him. Jesus is inside with a crowd. His family is outside calling for him. And Jesus says, "Who are my mother and my brothers? Whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother." He does not go out to them. Think about what that is. Not the theology, the human situation. Jesus' family showed up because they were worried. They thought he'd lost his mind. They were embarrassed. They wanted to get him out of whatever this was becoming. And he, inside the house with his followers, gave an answer that could only have hurt them. This is not a story about divine transcendence over family ties. This is a story about a family in conflict, a brother who had gone in a direction his siblings didn't understand, a mother who came with the brothers because someone had to, and a man who loved his family. We know he loved his mother, we know that from the cross, but had stepped into something larger than they could follow. The detail is too awkward to invent, too human, too uncomfortable. Mark would not have included it if it weren't true. And then John, chapter 7, verse 5. For not even his brothers were believing in him during Jesus' public ministry. His brothers did not believe. This is the Gospel of John, the most theologically elevated of the four Gospels, the one that opens with "In the beginning was the Word," and John includes this. His brothers didn't believe in him. Think about what that does to the perpetual virginity narrative. If the brothers are cousins or step-siblings or symbolic community members, why would John include the detail that they didn't believe? The awkwardness only lands if these are actual brothers, brothers who grew up with him, who knew him before the ministry, who had the specific variety of skepticism that comes from being too close. The person who seems most ordinary to you is the one you grew up with, the one who ate at the same table, shared the same roof, was subject to the same parents. His brothers didn't believe in him. That's a family. That's not a theological symbol. Here is something I want you to sit with for a moment. Richard Bauckham, professor at the University of St. Andrews, published a study in 1990 called Jude and the Relatives of Jesus in the Early Church. Bauckham traces a group called the Desposini. The word means those belonging to the Lord. It refers to the biological relatives of Jesus, the family. And what Bauckham documents is extraordinary. Jesus' biological family did not disappear from early Christianity. They led it. James, the James named in Mark 6, the brother Paul personally met, led the Jerusalem church for approximately 30 years. Not Peter, not Paul, not one of the 12 apostles, the man who grew up with Jesus. James was the leader of the mother church in Jerusalem until 62 CE. In that year, the high priest Ananus convened the Sanhedrin during a gap between Roman governors. Festus had died, and Albinus had not yet arrived. Ananus used the jurisdictional gap to execute James on a charge of transgressing the law. Josephus records this, not the church. Josephus. And Josephus notes that even many of the law-observant Jews were disturbed by this illegal execution. James, the brother of the Lord, killed 62 CE, erased from the historical record of Christianity within 2 centuries. Because by the 2nd century, the theology of perpetual virginity was consolidating. The theology required an only child. An only child had no brothers. A movement led by a brother no longer fit the emerging narrative. J.J. Benitez, after 40 years in these sources, identified this pattern in multiple interviews and books. The erasure of the family of Jesus mirrors the systematic pattern he documented throughout his research. Every figure who could represent an alternative authority to the Peter-based apostolic hierarchy was removed from Christian memory. James led the Jerusalem church for 30 years. He was Jesus' biological brother. He had a direct claim to authority that no theology could override. And the institutional church that built itself on the authority of Peter rather than the authority of the family needed James to be a cousin, or a step-sibling, or a symbol. Anything but what he was. A brother. Leading the first church. Killed for it. Then quietly erased. I need to tell you what the Council of Constantinople actually decided. Because the doctrine of perpetual virginity, the doctrine that requires the brothers to not be brothers, was not an original Christian teaching. It was defined at a church council. The Second Council of Constantinople, in 553 CE, formally conferred on Mary the title Parthenos, ever virgin. 553 CE, that is more than 500 years after Jesus. The Lateran Synod of 649 CE, under Pope Martin I, then codified the threefold perpetual virginity: antepartum, before the birth; in partu, during the birth; postpartum, after the birth. 649 CE, 619 years after the crucifixion. The doctrine that makes it impossible for James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas to be brothers was defined in the 7th century. This is not apostolic tradition. This is not what the first Christians believed and passed down. This is a theological position developed over 6 centuries, formalized at councils held long after anyone who knew the family was alive, built on the framework of a text the Church itself condemned. Think about what this cost, not doctrinally, humanly. James, the man who believed in his brother, eventually, who led the Jerusalem church when it could have disappeared, who preserved something of the original movement in the years before Paul's version became dominant. Killed 62 CE, mentioned in Josephus. Paul met him personally and called him the Lord's brother. And then slowly, over the following centuries, his relationship to Jesus was renegotiated. Cousin, stepbrother, symbolic brother, until the brother was gone. Only the cousin remained. Occam's research shows that James's descendants, the grandchildren of Jude, another of the brothers, were interrogated by the Emperor Domitian around 90 CE. Domitian was suspicious of any surviving relatives of Jesus who might have messianic claims. He summoned them, examined them, and they showed him their hands, working hands, calloused, the hands of farmers. Domitian, satisfied that they were no threat, dismissed them. Jesus's grand-nephews, dismissed by a Roman emperor because they were farmers. Not a dynasty, not a threat, just the people left behind, and within another generation, even their names were being debated. You are not wrong about this. I need to say that directly. If you have read Mark 6:3 and thought, "Forenamed sisters, this seems plain," you are reading it correctly. If you ever raised this in a religious education context and were given the cousin explanation and something in you quietly didn't close, you were right to keep it open. You are not lacking in faith. You are not disrespecting Mary. You are reading the text. The text has 4 names. The text has the word adelphos. The text has Paul's first-hand testimony. The text has Matthew's heos haon, until. The text has Luke's prototokos, firstborn. The text has a family that came to seize Jesus because they thought he was insane. The text has brothers who did not believe in him during his ministry. All of that is in the text, has been in the text since the 1st century. The explanation that overrides all of it was invented by one scholar in 382 CE, adopted by councils 500 years after Jesus, built on a source the Church itself condemned. You were told a doctrine. The text says something else. Let me tell you where Benitez lands on this, because Benitez spent 40 years in these sources, and his conclusions on the family of Jesus are some of the most direct things he ever wrote. Benitez's reconstruction in Caballo de Troya depicts Jesus in a full family context: siblings, family tension, brothers who didn't understand what he was doing. The scene in Mark 3, the family coming to seize him, appears in Benitez's account with the kind of texture that only comes from taking the source seriously. Not the sanitized version where the family comes out of concern, the uncomfortable version where they come because they are ashamed. In later interviews and writings, Benitez was direct. The Church's minimization of the family of Jesus, and specifically of James, was not accidental. It was institutional logic. James represented something the Peter-based apostolic succession could not accommodate: a direct biological claim, a leadership built on relationship rather than theological designation, a church of the family rather than a church of the institution. That kind of authority cannot be managed. It cannot be ordained. It cannot be appointed or removed. You are either the brother of Jesus or you are not. No council can vote on it. And so the councils found a different solution. They made him a cousin, and then they made him nothing at all. Here is what stays with me from months of sitting with this material. It is not the doctrine, it is not Jerome, it is not the council dates, it is John 7 verse 5. His brothers did not believe in him. That detail. A family trying to make sense of a brother who had become someone they didn't recognize. A mother who went with the brothers to find him. Brothers who stood outside the house and called for him while he talked to his followers inside. A brother, James, who eventually came around, who built something from what his brother had started, who led it for 30 years, who died for it, and was then slowly written out of the family, made into a cousin, made into a symbol, made into something that didn't complicate the theology. The Gospels record a real family, with the specific gravity of real families, siblings who don't understand each other, a mother caught between, a brother who becomes a leader and is killed before he's 60. That family is in the text. It has always been in the text. And the question that stays with me, the one I can't close, is what changed between the 1st century, when Paul could write, "I saw James the Lord's brother," without any theological anxiety about the word adelphos, and 350 years later, when Jerome needed to argue it had always meant cousin. Something changed. Something required James to not be a brother. And once you see what that was, the emerging doctrine, the institutional authority structure built on Peter rather than family, the need for an only child to protect the developing theology of Mary. Once you see the mechanism, you cannot unsee it. Open your Bible. Mark chapter 6 verse 3. The names are there. They have always been there. Before you were told what they meant. Before Jerome wrote his treatise. Before the councils met. Before the doctrine was formalized. James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, and sisters. In the text, in the verse. In Mark's account of the people who knew Jesus best, his own townspeople, dismissing him because they knew his family. The answer to the question you asked in that Sunday school room was not wrong because you were naive. It was wrong because the person giving it had inherited 17 centuries of institutional architecture built on a single word choice in a 4th century treatise. The names were always there, right where Mark left them. Waiting for someone to count, you decide what to do with this.